I don't have a huge amount of memories of my dad being at home, and I think a lot of the reason for that was because their marriage perhaps wasn't very good, but the times that he was there, I have really happy memories of him. He'd been in the spare room for a long time, and I remember that because the room that he moved into was just opposite my bedroom. I remember my mum didn't ever tell us that he was moving out. They basically then got divorced. My mother said that my father had been extremely violent, that there had been domestic abuse within the family, and a lot of the custody case hinged on the fact that he had beaten her. And I remember thinking a few years later that it's strange that I never heard any fights. Even after we went to bed in the evenings, I don't remember ever hearing anything. I never remember seeing any fights between them. I never remember my mum ever having any bruises or marks on her. It just didn't make any sense. Mum kept telling us again and again about events that she described where he'd been very unkind to us. So I can remember her describing them, but I can't actually remember them. And she used to say the same stories again and again and again. She used to say, "Oh, don't you remember when your father did that?" Or, "Can't you remember the way he spoke to you? Can't you remember your father shouting at your brother?" And I remember thinking, no, I can't really. I remember one day after school, she said to my brother and I, "There's some people coming to talk to you about who you want to live with." In the run-up to the meeting that I had with the social workers, she kept reminding us again and again about all the things that he had supposedly done. And I remember coming home from school, and I remember her sitting down on the sofa with me and my brother saying, "In a moment, you're going to be spoken to by these people, and they will ask you who you want to live with. And remember what you need to say. You need to say, 'I want to live with my mummy.' You need to say that. It's really important. You need to say that. And you cannot say anything about wanting to see daddy or live with daddy. You need to say to them that you want to live with mummy. You know that, don't you? Think about all those awful things he's done. You need to do that. Will you do that?" I remember nodding. And then when they came, it wasn't a very long meeting from what I remember. I can't remember how long it was, but I don't feel like it was very long. And I just repeated what I was told, because I was about 10 years old, and that's what you do. When your mother says to do something, you do it. I seem to remember that there was some sort of communication from my father, and I can remember my mum being absolutely livid. I remember her screaming down the phone at somebody. I don't know who she was on the phone to, but she was screaming down the phone. She was crying. She was absolutely hysterical, and I just wanted it to stop. And I think the message that gave us was any mention of my father gets her very, very upset, and she will shout and she will scream. And so my brother and I knew not to ever bring him up. We never ever mentioned his name. We knew that if we did, she would get very, very upset. She would get very angry. In my early 20s, my father got in touch with me personally. I didn't know what to do for the best, so I decided to be honest with my mum, and I told her, and again she went crazy. She was screaming and screaming and screaming at me. She was crying. She went from screaming to crying to screaming to crying. This seemed to go on for hours. I couldn't get her to stop. I remember being sat on my bed, curled up in a ball, just crying and wishing that I'd never mentioned it. She made me promise that I wouldn't reply to him. I did finally meet up with him, and I learned very quickly that he wasn't the person that he had been portrayed to be. I still felt immense guilt about seeing him. I still didn't tell her, because when you have a message from childhood that you do not bring something up, even when you're in your 30s, you do not bring something up because you just are so scared of the reactions. So for years I didn't tell her that I was seeing my father, and it's only been recently that she now knows that I have seen him. He's very gentle, he's very softly spoken, he's very well respected within his community that he lives in. One of the things that had confused me around the time of the divorce that I didn't feel that I could bring up was the fact that Mum was describing him to my brother and I as this dreadful, awful person who was violent. I can't remember exactly when it was brought up with me, but certainly at some point, I think during the divorce, my mother implied that she thought there'd been some sort of sexual abuse. And I remember thinking, that's so strange, like I don't remember anything like that at all. Years later, when I said to him about that, he said she threatened to bring that up unless she got what she wanted out of the divorce and the custody battle. And at the time, he'd fought and fought and fought. And when she made those threats, he felt that he couldn't fight anymore and he gave up. He's a really kind and lovely man who goes out of his way to help people out. He does lots of work for charity. He's got lots of grandchildren around him now, and he's a much loved member of the family. I definitely feel like my childhood has been stolen from me. I could have had 20 years of having a dad in my life, and that was taken away from me. It worries me that there will be children now and in the future that could be going through the same thing that I went through, and they might also miss out on 20 years of their father as well. My dad is now in his 80s. Thank goodness I've got a relationship with him now, but I don't know how much longer I'm going to have that relationship with him, and I just don't want other children to go through the same thing. I missed out 20 years of a life with my father.